On a quiet summer afternoon, the only sound is the distant hum of a lawnmower. Inside a sprawling waterfront mansion, a man lies motionless at the bottom of a grand staircase. Sunlight spills through the windows, casting a serene glow over the scene, yet an unsettling tension hangs in the air. Moments later, a woman bursts through the front door, running into the street, waving her arms for help. Her voice is frantic, her words urgent. Her husband needs medical attention. Within minutes, paramedics arrive, but as they step inside, they find a scene that doesn't quite add up. Small details, barely noticeable at first, begin to unravel a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. Steve Clayton's story begins in South Florida, where he was born around 1954. Details of his childhood are scarce, but one thing is certain. He had a remarkable capacity for kindness and an unwavering belief in helping others succeed. Friends, colleagues, and family would later describe him as the type of man who not only built his own path, but also reached back to guide others along theirs. By the time Steve was 30, he had qualified as an accountant and launched a physical therapy practice specializing in sports injuries. His drive and determination paid off, the business thrived, clients poured in, and his reputation grew. At just 42, Steve sold his multi-million-dollar company, entering a well-earned early retirement. However, retirement did not mean idleness. Steve dedicated his time to mentoring young entrepreneurs, teaching them the lessons he had learned from decades of hard work. Many would later say his guidance changed the trajectory of their careers. Steve was a man of vibrant energy, charismatic, sociable, and the life of the party. Though he never had children, he adored being an uncle. His love life was complicated, with 6 or possibly 7 marriages, but his last marriage would change everything. In 2010, Steve moved to North Carolina, where he met Lana Clayton through an online dating site. A dedicated nurse caring for patients in several Veterans Affairs hospitals, Lana's nurturing nature was irresistible to Steve. They married in November 2013. 2 years later, the couple relocated to an opulent waterfront mansion on Lake Wylie, South Carolina, a property modeled after George Washington's Mount Vernon estate. Surrounded by serene waters and rolling greenery, life appeared idyllic. Steve's family grew close to Lana, believing she made him happy. Yet, unbeknownst to them, Lana would later paint a very different picture of their marriage, one only she could fully explain. Everything changed on July 21, 2018. Around 1 p.m., Lana rushed from the house in a panic, flagging down motorcyclist James Blackidge. She claimed Steve needed urgent help and begged him to call 911. James complied, watching as she ran to another neighbor for assistance. Curiously, when that neighbor entered the house to check on Steve, Lana stayed outside. Emergency. Responders arrived minutes later. Body camera footage captured their entry into the grand home, eventually leading to the bottom of the main staircase. There, beneath a white sheet, lay Steve Clayton, pronounced dead at the scene. Lana told authorities that Steve had recently suffered from vertigo, intense dizziness that sometimes caused him to collapse. She explained he had been ill for days, unable to leave bed. On the morning of his death, she checked on him around 11 a.m. and then went outside to mow the expansive lawn for about 2 hours. Upon returning inside, she claimed to have found him at the foot of the stairs. Given his age, medical history, and the visible scene, investigators initially believed it was a tragic accident or perhaps a heart attack. Years earlier, Steve had suffered decompression sickness after a diving trip in the Bahamas, which had lasting effects. To many at the scene, his death appeared natural, but not everyone accepted that explanation. Steve's nephew, Nick French, a police officer from a neighboring county, arrived quickly after hearing the news. As he surveyed the house and the circumstances, he began to see warning signs that others had overlooked, subtle details hinting that something was not as it seemed. From the beginning, certain details about Lana's behavior on the day Steve died seemed off. She had not 1 but 2 phones in the house. As a trained nurse, she understood the urgency of medical emergencies. Yet, instead of calling 911 herself, she ran out into the street, flagged down a passing motorcyclist, and asked him to call for help. This decision cost precious minutes. Nick French noticed another detail immediately. The staircase had a runner, a strip of carpet that wasn't nailed down, just laid loosely on the steps. It was perfectly aligned, completely undisturbed. If Steve, a man of his size, had fallen down those stairs, the runner would have shifted. But it hadn't. The lack of physical evidence to support a fall was just the start. Steve bore no injuries consistent with tumbling down an entire flight of stairs. Perhaps some suggested he only slipped near the bottom, 1 or 2 steps at most. But to Nick, nothing matched the story. Lana's conduct in the aftermath raised further questions. Within hours, she was telling those around her that she wanted Steve cremated immediately. When the deputy coroner explained that an examination could reveal the cause of death and provide closure, she showed no interest. She didn't want an autopsy. She wanted him sent to the morgue and cremated without delay. Her explanation for this urgency was that Steve had been a heavy drug user and she feared an autopsy would tarnish his reputation. However, those who knew him well dismissed that claim. Steve occasionally smoked marijuana and enjoyed a Long Island iced tea, but he was far from an addict. When Nick mentioned calling Steve's other nephew, Chris, to inform him of the death, Lana resisted, firmly insisting Chris shouldn't see Steve like that. But Chris was an adult, and Nick felt he had the right to know. Eventually, Nick ignored her objections and made the call himself. That decision led him upstairs, where he made 2 troubling discoveries. First, Steve's cell phone was missing, an alarming detail given he always kept it close. Investigators would later suspect Lana had removed it days earlier, effectively cutting Steve off from outside help. The second discovery was even more disturbing. The master bedroom was in a state of severe neglect. The bed was saturated with urine, a clear sign Steve had been left without proper care while sick in bed. To Nick, it suggested abandonment, especially shocking given Lana's nursing background. Adding to the suspicion, Steve's sister, Rosie, had been unable to reach him for several days before his death, highly unusual for him. The troubling signs didn't end there. Once Chris was informed, he visited Lana to check on her and discuss Steve's affairs. As executor of Steve's estate, he asked for the will. Lana claimed there wasn't one, but Chris knew that was false. He had seen it himself. The truth would emerge later. Lana had burned it, ensuring that under South Carolina law, she would inherit everything as his spouse. Barely 2 weeks after Steve's death, at a memorial gathering in his honor, friends and relatives noticed something else. Lana had already boxed up his possessions. As they mourned, she seemed more concerned with clearing out his belongings than honoring his memory. She urged friends and relatives to take whatever they wanted, announcing that anything left over would be hauled to the dump. It was an unsettling scene, more like someone clearing space than someone mourning a spouse. Nick and Chris Clayton, however, were not about to ignore their instincts. Quietly, they reached out to the York County morgue on behalf of the family, requesting a full autopsy and toxicology without telling Lana. This decision would prove critical. Forensic toxicologist Demi Garvin and coroner Sabrina Gass conducted the examination, and the results left no room for doubt. Steve Clayton had been poisoned. His system contained extraordinarily high levels of tetrahydrozoline, the active ingredient in certain redness relief eye drops like Vicine. In the eyes, it constricts blood vessels, but swallowed in large amounts, it can shut down the respiratory system and cause death. Tetrahydrozoline is colorless, odorless, and tasteless, easy to slip into a drink unnoticed. In small doses, it causes nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. In large doses, it becomes lethal. The next question was obvious. Had Steve ingested the poison knowingly, or had it been given to him without his knowledge? On August 29, 2018, investigators invited Lana in for questioning. They told her she wasn't in trouble, at least not yet. By then, she was aware an autopsy had been conducted without her consent, but she had no idea that FBI agents and York County Sheriff's Office investigators were in an adjacent room listening in. At first, Lana played the role of the bewildered widow, insisting she had no clue what could have caused Steve's death. But when detectives mentioned tetrahydrozoline, her reaction shifted immediately. She recognized the chemical without hesitation and even said Visine aloud. It was a startlingly quick connection for such a specific substance, indicating she knew far more than she was admitting. Pressed for answers, Lana spun her first story, claiming Steve had been adding a few drops of Visine to his morning coffee for regularity, using it as some sort of laxative. Investigators were skeptical. There were countless safe and widely available remedies for digestive issues. Why would anyone reach for an eye drop bottle? When that story began to crumble, she pivoted again. The grieving widow became the long-suffering spouse, suddenly portraying Steve as a verbally abusive, controlling man and a drug user. But detectives already had Steve's toxicology report, which showed no signs of heavy drug use. When they looked into her abuse allegations, they found no supporting evidence. Realizing she was losing ground, Lana ended the interview and drove home, unaware that investigators were tailing her. Perhaps the pressure was too much, or perhaps she knew the truth was closing in. Shortly after arriving back at her house, she sat down with the investigators again and confessed. Lana claimed that after years of what she described as emotional abuse, she had snapped. She admitted to pouring an entire bottle of Visine into Steve's water, insisting she hadn't meant to kill him, only to make him ill for a day or two, enough to keep him from bothering her. Then she revealed something even more disturbing. 2 years before Steve's death, Lana had called 911 to report a shocking accident. She claimed she had been loading a crossbow for protection one night when it discharged, striking Steve in the back of the head while he slept. Incredibly, investigators at the time believed her, and Steve seemed to believe her too. Perhaps he thought there was simply no reason his wife would intentionally try to kill him. But on August 29, 2018, during her confession, Lana admitted the truth. It hadn't been an accident. She said she had fired the crossbow on purpose to stop what she described as abuse, claiming she feared he would come after her. Her poisoning confession also began to unravel. Detectives examining the bedroom scene concluded that Steve's death hadn't been the result of a single impulsive act. For days, while he lay in bed suffering from what she described as vertigo, Lana had been experimenting, adjusting the doses of tetrahydrozoline until she found the amount that would end his life. By the third day, she had given him a fatal dose. And then there was the missing phone. Investigators believed she threw Steve's cell into Lake Wylie to ensure that he could not call for help during his final hours, alone, immobile, and powerless. Although her admissions were damning, deputies didn't arrest her immediately. In the days that followed, Lana attempted to take her own life. She swallowed a large quantity of pills, turned on the gas inside her home, and was discovered by a neighbor who rushed to check on her. She survived, and on August 31, 2018, she was taken into custody and charged with murder. Once the truth was out, Steve's family began to reconsider the years leading up to his death. They wondered if the move to South Carolina had been strategic, as state law guaranteed that a surviving spouse would inherit everything if there was no will. They thought back to Steve's unexplained bouts of illness over the preceding months, symptoms that even top doctors could not explain. The case would soon echo in another tragedy. Just 3 weeks after Steve's death, only 12 miles north of Lake Wylie, 32-year-old Stacy Hunsucker died under suspicious circumstances. Her husband, investigators say, poisoned her with Visine to collect on a life insurance policy. Like Lana, he had her cremated immediately. But because Stacy was an organ donor, tissue tests were performed, revealing lethal levels of tetrahydrozoline. These two cases prompted significant changes in toxicology protocols across several states. Now, many laboratories routinely screen for tetrahydrozoline, a measure the Clayton family strongly advocated for. As for Lana, she ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and to tampering with food and drugs. She continues to claim she never intended to kill Steve. Prosecutors, however, argued that her motive was money, pointing to her destruction of his will and the calculated steps she took to isolate him as he lay dying. In court, they painted a chilling picture. A wife who poisoned her husband over several days, ignored his suffering, and ensured he had no means to call for help. The defense argued she was a lifelong victim of sexual abuse, suffering from PTSD triggered during her marriage. The judge was unmoved. Lana Clayton was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At her sentencing, Steve's sister and a close friend spoke through tears, leaving no doubt in their minds or the courts about what had happened. Lana killed Steve. For those who loved Stephen Clayton, the truth was almost impossible to absorb. One close friend and family member recalled, "At that moment, my world changed forever." This was Lana, someone they had welcomed into their circle without hesitation. They had never seen her display anger, greed, or bitterness. She had always seemed kind, supportive, and warm. Now, by her own admission, she was a murderer, a woman who had carefully planned and successfully carried out the killing of their brother, their dearest friend. This was no sudden crime of passion. It was calculated, methodical, executed with precision. The reality brought with it a flood of painful questions. How long had Steve suffered? Were the unexplained bouts of illness he'd endured earlier that year the result of slow, deliberate poisoning? Was he trapped in his own home as his body failed? Did he try to seek help when he made his way downstairs that final day? Did he know his life was slipping away? The answers will likely never be known. But for those who loved him, the uncertainty is haunting. The grief of losing Steve was compounded by the betrayal. They hadn't just lost him. They had been deceived by the person responsible. Lana had been embraced as a friend, trusted completely. She had fooled them all, even Steve himself, a man described as one of the most brilliant people they had ever known. The case was as strange as it was disturbing. But Steve's family never stopped pushing for the truth. Their persistence turned suspicion into evidence and brought a calculated killer to justice. In the end, it served as a grim reminder. If something feels wrong, it may be exactly what your instincts tell you it is. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.